Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jason. I'm one of the directors of UES Education. I'm very glad to be joined today by Alice Langdale, who is Head of International Applications at Marlborough College, or a title similar to that. I'll let Alice introduce herself in a moment, but today we're going to be talking about SAT and ACT accommodation. So thank you very much for joining us. We're going to attempt to try and cut through the very thick forest that is the accommodations process and all the issues associated with it, talk about some of the things that commonly go wrong, and also talk about some of the ways of mitigating those issues, and hopefully end on a fairly positive note. But before we get started, Alice, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, well, just to say hello, I'm Alice Langdale. So yes, you got the job title pretty much right. I think we all know what it means. I look after the international applicants or students applying to international universities at Marlborough College in Wiltshire. And yeah, happy to help. I don't think we're going to find final answers, but we'll certainly guide as much as possible.
Great, thanks, Alice. Right, so without further ado, I'm going to attempt to share my screen here. And there we go. Hopefully everyone can see that. Okay, so a little bit just about UES first of all. We've been going quite a number of years now, about 8.5 years. We work with a lot of students every year, particularly at this time of year. In total, around 800 students a year taking the SAT or ACT in the UK. Most of those students are taking courses in schools, but what it does mean is that we see a lot of the issues that students face, particularly on the accommodation side of things. So we're very used to trying to deal with these admissions. These issues. Alice is also very used to this, particularly on the ACT side, as you're going to find out. We also help students with all other aspects of the admissions process, and we work with a lot of schools. But today we're talking about accommodations. I know to some of you that might sound weird, like we're talking about getting housing in the States, but this is quite an American term. If you hear Americans talk about accommodations, they mean extra time. Or similar kind of adjustments for tests. If you want to ask about getting a room on campus, you need to talk about housing, not about accommodations. So just to dispel that myth, and hopefully that doesn't mean that loads of people are going to suddenly leave this webinar, otherwise you're in the wrong one. We're going to talk today about the processes for accommodations for the SAT and ACT. So what students have to go through, or families have to go through to apply for these. We're going to talk about the problems associated with that and what can go wrong. And then we're going to talk about some solutions and advice for families when they're going through this whole process, and similarly some advice for schools. And then finally talk about some very hopeful future improvements in this process. Okay, so first of all, just to explain, there are two entrance tests. I'm sure everyone here knows that. There's the SAT, which is on paper. There's the ACT, which is normally on computer, although let me caveat that. If you're going to be taking the ACT with extra time, you might be doing it on paper. More on that later. Students will only do one of these tests, not both. Some people do both, and I say this in every single presentation I do. Please don't be one of those people. Please prepare early, choose the right test, and stick to that one. You haven't got time to do both. If you are not sure, we do have a diagnostic test. It is free for everyone. Just go to that URL /diagnostic, take that test for free. But there is a consideration here about which test is best for you if you're doing it with accommodations, and we'll talk about that in a moment. There was something called the subject tests. They are gone. They are no more. They were administered for the last time in May, so you do not have to worry about these anymore. So it really is just between the SAT and ACT. So what are accommodations? So as I said, accommodations are, put very simply, non-standard test provisions. So if you are taking a test and you need something like extra time, or maybe you need some extra help in it, then those are what you call accommodations. But the most common one is extra time. Other common ones that we see are use of laptop or paper, extra breaks in the test, sometimes done over several days. Some people will get medical supervision and special breaks to administer medication. And as I said, there are other ones sometimes where students will get extra help, like someone reading out the test to them. That's much less common, but might be appropriate if that's something you get in your school exams. But for the most part, it is students who need extra time in the test. So what are the available accommodations? Now, there are lots available, but on the ACT, generally speaking, it's extra time, and the minimum is 50%. There is no such thing as 25% extra time like there are often in UK exams. So it's minimum of 50%. I've seen students get 100% extra time. I've seen students get 200% extra time. So 3 times as long as normal. That's normally done over several days though. With the ACT, if they're doing it in school, they might do it on the same day. That's common. Or they might do it over several days. And we've got several students who do it that way, doing a section a day over several days. Again, it depends on what the ACT has granted you. The ACT also, because the test is normally on computer, those extra times might, those accommodations might allow the student to do it on paper in school, or might be something that students get on the computer, but over a longer period of time. And the SAT, generally speaking, the most common extra time or most common accommodations that we see people get is 50% extra on paper, because the test is on paper anyway, on a single day. It's very rare that we see students with different accommodations to that. There's a very good reason for that, and that is that most people will be taking the test in a test centre if they're doing the SAT. Alice, do you want to come in here and talk about these different available accommodations and maybe talk about the different sorts of ones that you see? So just to explain, Alice works at Marlborough College, which is an ACT test centre and does provide accommodations there. So Alice, what sort of accommodations do you see?
Well, so I sit in a position where I'm a test centre coordinator. So that's one side of things, and that's the accommodations that I would see as that coordinator. The other side of things, of course, is the college counsellor position that I have, where I will support students whichever test choices they take. So, Jason, would you be most interested in the first instance for that account of the more general impression, or would you like the ACT test centre?
Maybe let's start with the latter. Start with the ACT test centre and talk about what, as a test centre, what are your limitations there, and what's the most common thing that happens?
So, as a test centre, we decided that we wanted to offer testing on campus for our students. And we made the decision due to various different factors that came together at the same time, that we would try to make our test centre an open test centre. There are lots and lots of schools testing in the UK, particularly in the private sector, that don't open up their testing for other students. And that's usually due to safeguarding security factors within their college. Our test centre was able to be a separate building just slightly away from the main campus, and it ticked those boxes. So we open up, we have 20 seats available on each test administration that we are in school for. So I don't open up, obviously, at April and things like that. We offer testing on most normally on just one of those days. It's normally a Saturday. We did offer Friday as well, and what we found was that students found it very difficult to get time off school on Fridays, and it was easier for them to travel on Saturday because their school would allow them to test on Saturdays. So we found that offering regular testing on Saturday was the most helpful we could be in that regard. So that's what we did. And then in terms of accommodations, which obviously is the focus here as a test centre, we wanted to be able to offer external students accommodations at our site. Now, for the ACT, the only way you can offer students that aren't at your school testing is to offer it as a computer-based test on the same test administration days, you choose which ones, as the international testing would take place. Okay. However, we were a little bit different and awkward. I don't want to get too involved in that detail yet, but we only offer those accommodations, that extra time testing, on just one day of the year at the moment, on a Friday in October, which we felt was the highest impact that we could have on that for that testing. If there were greater demand, in fact, fun enough, yes, just this morning I was asked to open up the test centre again for December. If there were greater demand, I would consider doing that for another day. But really, to open up our test centre for one other student, it doesn't make sense. But on that October one, we sometimes get around 10 to 15 requests for testing on that date. So they would take a test like any other, really, it would look the same really as any other test, except they'd have 50% extra time. So that comes on to the second part of that question. On the CBT, the computer-based testing, at our school, the only thing we offer for external testers is just the 50% extra time at CBT testing. And that point's really important because when you're an international tester for the ACT, any accommodations you're awarded, you're categorized as a special tester. Most commonly, the default for you will be for you to then be expected to take your ACT at your own school, actually on paper, not on the computer, administered by a TAME member of staff who's happy to do it. Okay. Now, if you're a test centre, you naturally will then be asked, well, hang on a second, if you're going to take external candidates, can you run that test on the computer with extra time, which we do. So it's a little bit complicated. If you are not a test centre, and Jason, I know you're going to go into this in a lot of detail later, but really you default to paper-based testing at your school. Is that a good start?
Yeah, that's a great start. It does cover a lot of what I'm going to say. Yeah. I think just to sum up at the moment, the most common thing that people want for the ACT and SAT is 50% extra time. That more than covers most people's needs. Where the students do have very different needs or need more extra time or have other accommodations and other considerations, it sometimes makes it difficult to actually test in a test centre, and the easiest thing is then testing on paper in school. Now, that is more common with the ACT than it is with the SAT, and students do need to be aware of that early on.
So I should have said it. The testing that we would see most commonly in that category would be somebody who possibly has ADHD or something like that, an anxiety-based request, and they may test for each section on each day over a course of a week. That's probably the other one that would be most common, but it's not a particularly straightforward, they don't grant it that easily. I think that's something to bear in mind.
Great. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the process then. So what do students or families have to do in order to get these accommodations? So I'm going to try and talk about the ideal process. So this is the way it should work. So with the SAT, it's generally quite straightforward, and there are consequently fewer problems that happen. We'll explain why in a moment. But with the SAT, what happens is that the student normally will ask their school to apply for accommodations on their behalf. That's the first thing that happens. You can't actually book your extra time tests until the school has applied and you've been granted the accommodations. So the student asks the school first, or the family asks the school. If granted, now, the school will have to submit all the evidence, and we'll come on to what kind of evidence that is in a bit. But if granted, the student receives what's called an SSD code. That then allows them to go online onto the College Board and apply for a test with accommodations. There are lots of test centres around the UK, particularly the big international schools, that allow that. Often if a school is a SAT test centre, they might have accommodations as well. And as I said, if it's a straightforward accommodations of 50% extra time, they should find a place as long as they do this early enough. And then the student will take that test on the same day as students taking the normal test in the test centre. So that's how it works, the SAT, nice and straightforward. And as I'll say several times during this presentation, if you start early, that is entirely possible to do, if of course you should get the accommodations. Now let's talk about the ACT. Slightly different. First of all, everything is backwards. The student has to register for the test online first and has to choose either in school or on a test centre or at a test centre. Now, this is the first point where things can go wrong, but I'm just going to talk about the ideal situation, first of all. So the student registers for the test. As part of that process, they're going to have to say which their school is. The school will then sometimes get a notification, or the student will pass on the information to the school. The school then, just like the SAT, applies for the accommodations for the student. If it is granted, the student is then booked into that test that they already registered for, and then they go and take that test. Now, hopefully that is in school. They've already worked with the school to allow that. In other cases, they might have booked a place at a test centre that has accommodations. Very commonly in the UK, that will be Marlborough College. So again, if the student has done this all in plenty of time, the school has submitted the relevant evidence and it's valid in time, then this process should work, whether or not they book it in school or at a test centre. Now, where this goes wrong, of course, is that student books for a test centre, then it's too long before the accommodations are granted because they didn't allow enough time. Suddenly there are no places left at that test centre, or they're scrambling around trying to find another test centre, or trying to convince the ACT to swap the registration to being in school. This is where things can go wrong. So just to talk about a few general issues here before we really go into the thick of it. The general issue is registering in time. This is by far the most common problem with accommodations. If everyone started this process, let's say a year before they were going to take the test, it would be much easier to sort things out. But the problem is that students and families don't know that it's going to take a long time to get these accommodations granted. Often people quite rightly think, well, I've had extra time in school all the way through school, so of course I'm going to get it for the SAT or ACT. That is not the case. It is not default. It's not a case of simply saying, I get extra time and here's the evidence. The school needs to submit that evidence. That evidence needs to be aligned with what the SAT or ACT expects. Then it has to be granted. That can take a long time. And then, of course, you have to go and find the test centre that allows you to take the test. So registering in time is the big one. Getting the accommodations approved, and related to that, EdPsych reports that we'll come on to, but getting those accommodations approved takes time. You have to convince the testing board, so the College Board for the SAT or the ACT, you have to convince them that your accommodations match up with the needs of those standardized tests. And those tests are very different to UK exams. So it's not just a case of assuming that because you get extra time in school, it's going to be okay. Now, EdPsych reports are very useful, but the problem is that if it's not an EdPsych report that really matches up and explains why they need those accommodations for the standardized tests, sometimes that won't be good enough. And secondly, if that EdPsych report is too old, let's say from the beginning of secondary school, that is probably not going to be looked at by the SAT or ACT. So that's another problem, is suddenly realizing at the last minute that you need all these things, but you haven't got enough time to get it together. And just to explain, there are only a few people that we know of in the UK who are very experienced at doing educational psychologist reports for US exams. I know that they have a waiting list up till April already. So you really got to start early if you think you need to get a new educational psychologist report. And then there's the availability of the test centre. So if you have started too late and then you're trying to find a test centre that has extra time, it might be that all those places are booked up. So these are the general issues. I know, Alice, you'll want to say a few things about that, but what I want to do is go on to the ACT issues, and then we can maybe drill down into those a bit more. The other bit is the appeals process. Now, if you don't get the accommodations granted, you can appeal it. Now, that can take a very long time as well. Generally speaking, there is a lack of understanding on both sides. When I say both sides, I mean on the testing board side, a lack of understanding about the issues facing international students. But on the UK side, a lack of understanding about how the process works in America and what they're looking for. So it really means starting early and communicating well to make sure that you can navigate these issues. But let's talk a bit about the particular ACT issues. So one of the issues is that students might register for the test or they have to register for a test before applying for accommodations. This causes a problem because they might register for a test centre when they really should do it in school, and then it's hard to get it swapped, or vice versa, and the school doesn't want to host a test. So it's very difficult to get that changed later. So it's really important that students talk to their schools about this first, find out what the best option is. It is also, to be very upfront about this, very difficult to speak to the ACT if something goes wrong. And that, again, is related to the fact that those testing boards don't quite know the process for international students. This is getting better, and we hope it's going to get better in the future. But anyone who has had problems with accommodations before will attest to how many hours they have spent on the phone to the ACT. I'm trying my best to be diplomatic and not be too critical of the ACT here, but you do have to remember there are relatively few international students taking this test compared to the millions in America. So you can understand their customer services are very focused on Americans. So it's really important, again, to make sure that you start this process early, speak to experts about it before just deciding to click something or register for something, because it's very hard to get it changed later. Alice, do you want to talk about any of these issues in particular, or maybe if I've missed anything here as well?
I just on the slide before, one point you said, which is spot on, is the EdPsych reports that a student has shouldn't be too old. But the other thing I think we need to be really careful about here is it also can't be too new. And what I mean by that is that if it is an updated EdPsych, so if you've always had EdPsych reports, maybe when you were 15, and maybe an updated one when you're in the lower sixth, when you're 17, that's entirely normal and sensible. But what I would say probably won't work out for students with either the SAT or the ACT actually is the scenario where you've had a go at a few and actually you're finding it hard to finish within the time. You might have a hint that you may need accommodations, and then you think, well, look, I'm going to do an EdPsych report. And the 4-month rule then comes into play, that if you're inside that window, they're not going to give you extra time if it is a slight knee-jerk reaction to be under pressure, perhaps for the ACT, let's say the math section. So be a little careful. You just got to think ahead a little bit about these things. And really, as you're finishing your GCSEs, really, that's the time to get cracking on all of this. So, you know, however old, if you're not doing GCSEs, if you're international, whatever that might be, you're basically 16 and you're moving into your sixth form, moving as a sort of high school junior. That was the main point on that. The ideal scenario, really, the thing about the ACT is that they sometimes are baffled that we're finding it difficult, because when everything is done right, it really works quite well, to be honest. You know, you get your extra time. It's been given to you for, let's say, that test on the 11th of February, whatever it may be. You click the box saying you want a paper-based test. What will then happen is your school, it'll trigger on your school's platform a little blue icon that says, do you agree to run this test? As a me, I'd click yes, I do, and that's all fine. It can work out just fine. But if there are any permutations within that, either an appeal or that you've tried to test at one place and then you want your test transferred to your school or something like that, that can be enough just to throw it off whack. So that's the ACT can be really frustrating in that respect. One thing I'd say from a teacher's point of view, and this may sound a little bit defensive, but there's every impression on the ACT site that the college counsellor, your pin person at the school, typically me, has got control over what the ACT are doing, and they really don't. They're just as in the dark as you, in fact, often worse, because they're not allowed to communicate on your behalf to the ACT, and they can't see any of the platform that you see. So it really can be it can break down relations a little bit. So if we all work together, it tends to work out much better. And we always get there in the end. That's probably the last thing to say on that.
Great. Yes, we do always get there in the end, given enough time. So I think part of the problem, and this really goes back to what I was saying about starting early, because let's say you're a student who suddenly decides to do this towards the end of lower six. So let's say next term, you suddenly say, oh, I want to do the SAT or ACT. Now that would be fine if you didn't need accommodations. You've got plenty of time still to do those tests. if you do need accommodations, you're looking at a several-month wait to get them approved, perhaps. And then you've run out of time and run out of potential test centres and tests to do that. And if there is an issue, trying to resolve it with your school over the summer is going to be very, very difficult. So again, really make sure that if you're thinking about this, start early. And we've said about the few test centres available for extra time. So it's always good to get that done nice and early. So what are the solutions here? Well, I wish I had a perfect answer for you, but start early, of course, is a big solution. Now I've said get a new EdSite report. Alice, thank you for your comment about it being too new and not matching up with your previous requirements. That could be detrimental, but do consider getting an EdSite report that adds to your current report and at least explains it from the American side of things. And there are education psychologists available in the UK. If you do want to contact us afterwards, we've got people who can help with that and are familiar with the SAT and ACT. Do consider your test choice very carefully. As an organisation that helps an awful lot of people with the SAT and ACT, making that decision on the right test, whether you need accommodations or not, making that decision on the right test is probably the most important decision you can make to achieve success in the test. Again, make that decision early. Now, we do have a diagnostic, and I gave you the link earlier. It's our website /diagnostic. But if you get extra time, there are a few things you need to consider. You need to consider where you're going to do the test. Is it in school or at a test centre? What test centres are available? And thirdly, do you suddenly find that because you've got extra time on the ACT, that takes out the consideration about how time pressured the ACT is and actually makes it easier for you? So there are very good reasons that people might do SAT if they didn't get extra time, but would do ACT if they did, for example. So do consider that very carefully. If you're not sure, talk to someone about it, i.e. us. Do work with your school. As Alice said, it's very easy for the relationship between the school and the family to break down when the family doesn't understand how difficult this is for the school. The earlier you can talk to the school and work with them to help them help you, the easier that whole process will be. So work with everyone available and do understand how difficult it is for everyone. ACT solutions, so as with all the previous slides, we've got some particular ACT solutions here. Speak to your school first. If you think you're going to apply for accommodations with the ACT, here's the difficult thing, because as a student or a family, you are able to book that test without even speaking to your school and then spring upon them the fact that they need to apply for the accommodations and maybe host it. It's probably better to speak to them first. And ideally, if a school isn't familiar with this, do explain to them that all you're asking them to do is to host that test for you. There is a lot of misunderstanding, quite understandably, on the school's part, that they think that if they're hosting this paper-based test, that they're hosting it for everyone and anyone can book in. It doesn't make them become a test centre. All it says is that they are willing to host that test for you on that date. Doesn't mean they have to do it for anyone else. So do, again, speak to them early, explain to them how this works and how much easier it's going to be for them if you can take it on paper. Because if they say no, and there's no way they're going to allow you to take it in school, you're going to have to do it at test centre. And getting that changed later might be difficult. So again, speak to your school. Register for the correct one, as I said. So ideally in school, if you've got the school's permission, otherwise at a test centre. I am in a moment going to share my screen to show you what it looks like. I think this will be quite helpful for people because it does look really confusing and it's very easy to choose the wrong one. And then afterwards, follow up with your school. Make sure that they've got the information. The ACT does ask you to forward an email to them. If they've registered already for the online system, the school will get a notification. But either way, just check with them and politely ask, hey, I've applied for the accommodations as we discussed. Please can I check that it's all gone through okay? Schools are busy and it's very easy for things to go awry. So do follow up with them politely. But what I'm going to attempt to do here is to stop sharing for a moment and then share my screen because let's make sure that I've got the right thing up here. just want to show you what it looks like. So I'm going to have to sign in again. Okay. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see this screen here. Here I am in my pretend ACT account. This is what it looks like when you sign in to my.act.org, which is the site for registering for the ACT. And there's a big button here that says register for the ACT. That's the same for everyone. So if I click on that, it tells you it's going to take you about 30 minutes, probably will. They do ask a lot of questions that actually you don't need to answer about your school and about courses that you want to do at college, same as they do for the SAT registration. Colleges don't see that unless you grant permission, and it doesn't affect your test registration, so you don't have to spend a lot of time thinking about that carefully. But here's the first thing it asks you. Will you be testing in the US or outside the US? For most people, this is very straightforward. You're testing outside of the US. Of course, it might be that you've suddenly decided to go home to the US, or you're on holiday in the US, and you want to do it in the US and you want to get it moved. That will be a problem. But if you're sure where you are going to be taking the test, click the right button. Now, if you're testing outside the US, the next question, here's the important one. Are you an examinee with a disability who needs accommodations to access the ACT test? i.e., do you want extra time or something similar to that? Click yes, accommodations needed. Here is the bit where everything can go wrong. There are two options here. You do not get this for the SAT. This is unique to the ACT. But basically, it's saying on the left, I want to test in a test center, and on the right, I want to test in school. It is very, very easy to think that you should default to the test center. So the one that says test for time and a half, and I can test online. Yeah, I can do that. And suddenly you click on that left-hand one and you are into the test center registration, and getting it swapped to in school, very, very hard. So again, please speak to your school first, and ideally you want to do this one, the right-hand side, where you can test in school. And if you click on that, you're probably not going to be doing it with writing. It's very rare that anyone does now. Anyway, and then suddenly you can see here, you have got these test windows. So around every test date, you have a window of about 3 weeks where you can test in school. And what will happen if the school has agreed is that the school will agree with you a date or a series of dates where you will take the test. And it has to be within these windows. So let's say you want to do the February test, you click on that, and then you go through, and then the rest of it is all about booking the test. And then you will send that to the school and they'll apply for the accommodations. If you've already been granted it before, it will go through pretty straightforward. Once the school agrees, the paper will get sent to the school and you do the test in school as decided. So that's how it should work. If you chose the other option, the test center, you'd have to choose the test center that you would like to test at. And again, you won't see many on there if you need accommodations. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing and go back to the presentation. There we are. So again, do make sure that you work with a school and follow up with them once everything's been submitted. Okay, some advice for schools, and I'm sure Alice will add to this. There's that advice again. Do advise students early. If you're a school that knows that you've got SAT or ACT takers, or anyone who's interested in America, ideally towards the end of year 11, if you can get in front of them then, talk to anyone who you know gets extra time in school and say, hey, you might want to start thinking about applying for accommodations nice and early. Now, if you're a school that's a sixth form and you've got lots of people who come in at the beginning of sixth form, talk to them at the beginning. Say, is anyone taking the SAT or ACT? Do you get extra time in school? If so, let's start applying for accommodations now. It's really important to do that early on, ideally towards the beginning of sixth form. There's a lot of pleases in this one, but basically, please consider allowing your ACT students to test in school on paper. It will really make their lives easier. Of course, sometimes there are good reasons why schools can't do that, but I promise you it is much, much easier than you think it is. We have worked with plenty of schools to change their processes to allow this. It's really simple. You get a choice of any day within 3 weeks to administer the test. You put the student in a room with a nominated teacher, and the teacher can get on with their work as a 3-hour or, well, okay, maybe 4-hour test. It's really simple. They send you the paper, you send it back to them, and everything should go quite smoothly. Please don't assume that accommodations will just be granted. This is the same advice as for families. Just because they get extra time in school does not mean that it will be granted for the SAT or ACT. And don't assume that it's just a case of sending off the documentation and it will go through. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. So making sure that all the relevant information is there nice and early will make it easier. And do utilize companies that, like us, and any teachers that you might know, or good counsellors, because first of all, we've got a lot of experience with this, can advise you about what the best course of action is. We are also able, now I don't want this to sound like we're able to go and tell the SAT or ACT what to do, but we are at least able to talk to some people within those organisations in very difficult situations with some students. So do talk to us if you've got any confusions or worries about that or any particular students. You can also talk to Alice about it if it's you're thinking about hosting the ACT. I'm sure she'll have lots of advice for you. And do utilise educational psychologists that you know. I'm sure most schools will have educational psychologists that they recommend. So do talk to them nice and early about whether they can help as well. Alice, do you have anything to add to this for advice for schools? You're muted.
Yeah, I couldn't get my arrow back. Yeah, I would just say a couple of things really for schools and for the student on the ACT or SAT choice. I think one of the factors, let's more positive sort of slant on this, is that there's something for some students that's rather lovely about them able to take the ACT with you at school. They don't have to travel across the country to be at a test centre by 7:30 in the morning, where it's unfamiliar. They may be rather nervous. They may have difficulties with anxiety or whatever it may be. And actually an SAT in a different school actually may not be a particularly helpful scenario for them. So I would make a consideration when you're going down this whole route and the conversation with families, or if it's a family listening now, what's the best scenario for me in that test environment? So I for sure, I've had students who've tested with us who could have chosen the SAT, but instead they've tested with us on paper in a familiar environment with someone they know. And I have a feeling it might get the best out of them, actually. And I think that's worth bearing that in mind. The other thing I'd say is if you are applying as a student with A-levels, so for us, it would be an old Mulberrian, but somebody who has left your school, I would go as strongly as to say you might be better off going with an SAT, because you can take that at a general centre. You're not then asking your school, which you are no longer enrolled in, to then administer a test for you, unless you really do have a school where you have somebody who would help you do that. That's quite very often the students I find who come to me will be students who have left their schools. Just a little thing, Jason, it's 2 weeks now. There's a 2-week, they've shortened it. It's a 2-week window. May not seem like a big factor, this, but be a little careful. So if you choose the October test, half of that 2 weeks will probably be half term. So you have to just bear that in mind. All right, just look at the weeks. But it also means the April test for the ACT becomes available to you in schools, because the April will tend to be in the holidays, the April test itself, but you still have a week left, usually as the summer term begins, where you could have that test administered. And it's quite a nice way to do it. And the elephant in the room that we haven't talked about at all, Jason, is that it isn't the silver bullet, extra time. So sometimes if this is all too difficult to get the extra time, maybe give a test a go, or maybe don't test at all. Okay, and that's the sort of the broad advice I would give people as they approach these things. In addition to the final thing is that if you're a school wondering, or if you're going to talk to a school about all this and they haven't ever supported anybody through this process, it takes a little bit of time for the school to set up their account on the ACT or the SAT systems, the SDD for the College Board or the TAA for the ACT. So you need to give them time to do that. That could take a little while, and it's all just quite a lot of admin. So just give them a bit of heads up that that's going to need to happen, and that's, they can get ahead of that paperwork.
That's great advice. Yeah, that is something that we've run into, where schools who are new to this process have kindly said, yes, we will host a student, and then discovered how much work they've got to do to get their account set up. And it is very confusing when you're new to the kind of American jargon as well for it. So that's great advice. One last little piece of advice here is that I did write a blog article about this that tries to distill all the different factors and the advice for students and schools in there. So schools and students, please read that. If you are a student or a family trying to convince your school of this, it might be worth you showing them that, because it just explains why there's a process like it is and what goes on behind the scenes there. So just a few vague predictions for the future. Hopefully the ACT will improve and simplify this process. They certainly have made positive noises about understanding the difficulties for international students, and there are good signs that things will become a bit easier on that, particularly on that registration front. They are also talking about introducing more test centres that can cope with accommodations in the UK. Again, I do think the default for people should be to take it in school, and a simplified registration process will make that easier. But for those students who do need to test in test centres because their schools won't let them do it in school, more test centres with accommodations would be useful. For both the SAT and ACT, there is a hope that the customer service for international students will improve as people like us and Alice bring these, I won't say complaints, but issues to the fore with the testing companies, and they understand that the customer services for international students has to improve. And the one that I say all the time is, I really, really hope that in the future there are online at-home tests. So many other tests, ones like the GRE, GMAT, IELTS, TOEFL, students can do it on their own computer at home or in school. That is great. They are far more secure than people realise, and both the SAT and ACT have said that this is their aim. We just don't know when it's going to happen. But that will remove an awful lot of the issues with this. Now, of course, there will be students with accommodations issues who still need to do it in school, still need to be supervised. But if you're a student who just needs the extra time and can be granted it, imagine if you could just do it in the comfort of your own school or home, and not have to worry about traveling somewhere or getting the school to supervise. So that is, fingers crossed, something that will happen in the near term, maybe medium term. Just to let you know, registration links are there. It's the same for extra time and normal students, so please do go to those and register early. Again, if you're registering for the ACT, please make sure you talk to the school first about maybe doing it in school. If you are wanting to do tests after July, then they won't open until June, but again, register very early. As always, UES can help with any of the things to do with applications. As Alice will attest to, we run courses for SAT and ACT in schools. If you are a school thinking about that, then please do contact us. And we also have our own external courses and private tuition. And if anyone has any questions about general applications or about sports scholarships, that sort of thing, we can answer those questions for you. Those are our contact details there. Okay, Alice, before we finish, do you have any other points? There are some questions in the chat as well, so we'll go through those in a moment. But before we take those, anything that I've missed, Alice?
No, not at all. I would just back up your statement about it really isn't very hard to run the paper test at school. You just need time, someone who's got time to give the day to it, really, in very practical terms. So I'd encourage people who are willing to work with their schools to convince them of that, work gently, and find someone who'll do it. And then really, I think that's a really nice way to do it. So that'll be the final thing I've got to say on that.
Good. Okay, well, we've got a question here. And Alice, I think this is probably one that you'll be best placed to answer. The question is, what evidence is actually required for the ACT extra time? So this person said that their daughter qualifies for extra time in school here, I guess in the UK, but she's never had an educational psychologist report. The help desk, I guess for the ACT, advised getting a USA appropriate report, and that's what I suggested as well. But she says that you're suggesting this isn't always necessary. They add that they've probably broken the rule about allowing enough time. But let's see if we can get to the bottom of this one. So this student doesn't have an educational psychologist report. My feeling would be that they probably should get one. What would you say, Alice?
Yes, I think they would need one. Now, whether it is specifically done for the US or whether they would have one anyway, I'm imagining it's Heidi for the UK exams. But what I would suggest you do within what we have done here before is to get extra time for the UK exams actually has got that bit more complicated. They now have to have additional factors anyway, but we've worked with our Ed Psych within the college to ask them to specifically mention 50%. Should that be appropriate for international exams, and specifically mention standardized testing. That's what we've done to try and sort of, in effect, upgrade the standard UK Ed Psych report. I think that I think what I would also do, the kind of paperwork, in fact I did it today, that we would also submit is a cover letter from my learning support department, who would say a real summary of what the students' needs are. And I would ask them to put in writing on that as well, that the current amount they have, and some wording that suggests that the norm of 50% would therefore be appropriate. That helps. The other thing we do is that we do a collection of comments from teachers. We do that as standard anyway to support our UK exam requirements. So that would come into it as well. But I think the crucial thing there in all of this is you have to show, is it their current way of working to have additional time? Does the Ed Psych report support that? And can you show that from your teachers are supporting that as well? On the whole, with the SAT, if you've got those things, they won't even ask to see documentation. You don't even have to. You just have to click the boxes saying, yes, they get 50% extra time on all these criteria. And it'll say, right, we don't need to see any documentation, and they'll just award it. Okay, that's for people with learning, probably dyslexia type difficulties. I'm just, there you go, on the chat there, you will have seen this because you quite clearly have got onto the ACT, but that's their recommendations for what paperwork you need. And it's all or nothing, actually, in some respects, that it's given a lot of guidelines without specifics. Now, the SAT, which I didn't look up just now, used to specify particular tests that they had to take to be recognizable. But I think the SAT has actually softened that requirement, so long as you have 50% mentioned within the criteria. So I'm afraid with your question here, that a report isn't necessary. I don't think that is the case. I think that you have to show, if it's your normal way of working, supported by a report, that will go through really quite easily. And with the ACT, I found that to be the case as well, on the whole, that if it's your normal way of working, that will be supported quite quickly.
Great.
Does that answer that?
Yeah, that's really good advice. And I think for this particular person, the advice might be, depending on which test you're hoping to take and how soon you need to do this, then it might be easier to go down the SAT route rather than scrambling around trying to find the Ed Psych report very, very quickly, because it sounds like that might be more likely to go through. But of course, and this leads me on to the next question, actually, it depends on whether or not the SAT is something that your daughter wants to do or is able to do. So the other question we've got here is, this person says, if you are a student who has extra time in exams and is hoping to get it for tests, like SAT and ACT, do you think you should think about accommodations when choosing between the SAT and ACT? I.e., if your school is an SAT test centre but not ACT, might you think more about doing the SAT? And I think that's a really important question, because as soon as you go into the realms of accommodations, the question is much more than just which tests are you more likely to do well on, because the things that might make you do well might be things like, well, how comfortable are you going to be doing this test? Do you have to do it on paper or on computer? How far are you going to have to travel to take this test? And often I say to people, look, if your school is an ACT test centre, it might be better for you to do ACT because it's going to make it a much more comfortable environment for you. If it's an SAT test centre, then maybe SAT is better for you. So the answer is yes, you should think about the accommodations when you're considering the test, and think about those factors and decide what's more important to you. And I've certainly seen a lot of students who said, I would rather do the SAT in London than travel across the country and do the ACT because my school's not letting me do it on paper. But if you can do it on paper in school, that might be by far, as Alice has said, it might be by far the most comfortable option, because you're doing it in a familiar environment with someone you know. So, but if you can do that, that might be the nicest way to do it. Of course, as long as you've got the time to get the necessary documentation together to get your school to approve that. So I hope that answers all those questions. I don't think we've got any other questions, and we're coming up to the hour. So Alice, unless you have anything else to say, I think we'll finish it there.
I agree with you completely. I think people should be far more pragmatic, and gameplay should go on a lot more about choice of SAT and ACT than actually goes on. I don't, respectfully, and I don't know as much as you do about the diagnostic testing, but I'm not that purist on that. I think there are lots of things that determine whether somebody's done well. And I also think for the students I know who've done both tests, their test conversions are usually pretty similar. So whatever they really commit to, they'll tend to do okay on the whole, I tend to find. So really, I'd look at travel, test availability, and comfort as really big factors when choosing testing.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think being in the slightly privileged position of being in London, where you've got good availability of SAT and ACT test centres, and that if you're not doing it with extra time, then you've got far fewer things to worry about in terms of comfort of the exam. But no, I completely agree that the most important thing is, as ever, starting early and practicing hard. That's going to be the thing that gets you a good score, regardless of which test you're doing. So that should probably be your biggest consideration. Alice, thank you so much for joining us today. And I really appreciate all your insight and your knowledge and experience on this. Alice, are people able to contact you if they've got any questions at all? Alice is just typing it into the chat. I think this is particularly relevant for schools if they've got any questions about hosting the ACT and asking about the accommodations process. You're also welcome to contact us. You've got our contact details. You'll get an email after this webinar as well. So thank you very much to everyone who joined us. And thank you to everyone who is listening on the recording. And as ever, just drop us an email with any questions. But for now, thank you very much and good night.